When you think of Honda's great, iconic motorcycle engines through history, I'm guessing high-revving inline fours come to mind. Or perhaps you think of reliable, oil-tight twins powering small street bikes, or maybe utilitarian workhorse singles. But what if I told you that Honda's arguably greatest engine was something very different? A V4 no less, one that was way ahead of its time. This is the story of how Honda made and perhaps ruined their greatest engine ever. Much of the information in this video comes from the incredible, and I do mean incredible, book on Honda's V4 motorcycle history by Greg Pullen. It's incredibly thorough. I'll make sure to link it in the description below if you guys want to learn more. Like many great motorcycles through history, the one we're looking at today was born on the racetrack. I think many would assume that we are currently living in the era of high-performance V4 engines being used for the highest level of motorcycle racing, as Ducati and Aprilia and pretty much every manufacturer has moved to the V4 configuration for MotoGP, but it really began decades ago. We just kind of had a hiatus in between. The 70s was such an important decade for motorcycle development. It was also a decade that was a picture of just how fickle we motorcyclists can be. Because at the beginning of the 70s, really the dawn of the modern high-revving inline four-stroke motorcycle, and the birth of superbikes, one could say, these motorcycles from Japan were praised for their innovation and reliability and performance, but just a few years later, Phil Schilling would coin the term the Universal Japanese Motorcycle, or UJM. Not necessarily meant as a criticism, but still getting at the fact that the big Japanese four manufacturers, all known initially for their own unique motorcycles with unique forms, from 2 and 3 and 4 cylinders to 2 strokes and 4 strokes, at this point they were kind of all now making motorcycles in the same form, high revving, overhead cam, inline 4 bikes. It was becoming boring to some, and Honda was frustrated by the fact that everyone was now using this UJM term because the other brands were using Honda's formula, the formula that they had pioneered and really built on the racetrack. And in their opinion, these weren't universal Japanese motorcycles, these were Honda and Honda clones. Honda once again needed a standout engine format, and they decided to build it in the same way that they'd built all of their great high-performance engines on the racetrack. The problem was, Honda wasn't racing at this point. And as the 70s came to a close, two-strokes had completely taken over every class of Grand Prix racing. Honda was behind the curve. They didn't just need to do something different, they really needed it to work, and they needed it to be so good and so revolutionary. At first glance, the big 6-cylinder CBX was unique, but in all reality, it was just a continuation of Honda's decades-long pursuit of building the ultimate high-revving multi-cylinder 4-stroke. This bike really needed to be something different. In 1977, Honda announced that they would be returning to racing, but at this time, they had no race bike. Still, they were confident that they could build something competitive in a short amount of time. They decided early on to build a V4, something unheard of in Grand Prix racing. Greg Pullen's chapter on this whole strange saga is titled Lessons Learned the Hard Way, and boy, is that accurate. Because this race bike, known as the NR500, with NR standing for New Racing, well, it was a failure in pretty much every respect. Soichiro Irimajiri partnered with young graduate Saguro Kanazawa and about 100 other people, many of which were not primarily motorcycle engineers, but rather experts in fields like aeronautics. They worked to create a 4-stroke 500cc race engine capable of revving up to 22,000 RPM. Honda needed this innovation to compete with the powerful 2-strokes from competitors like Suzuki and Yamaha, as reinventing a 2-stroke platform wasn't really an option at this point. The team decided to increase engine speed and valve area by using oval pistons to double the number of valves, thus allowing more air and fuel mixture for higher compression and more power. Regulations limited the number of cylinders, but not the cylinder shape, so Irimajiri tested a single-cylinder oval piston engine, which showed promising results. The NR500 was then developed, featuring a water-cooled, double overhead cam V4 engine with pistons that were essentially 2 straight sides and 2 curved ends. This design required 2 conrods per cylinder, resulting in a total of 32 valves. Despite this innovative approach, the initial engine produced only 80 horsepower at 14,000 RPM. The NR500's chassis was equally unconventional, using a monocoque frame made of sheet aluminum and a side-mounted radiator, but it proved difficult to service. The bike's first outings in the 79 GP races ended in failure, with disappointing power and also just not great reliability. For the 1980 season, Honda switched to a conventional tubular steel frame, front-mounted radiator, and traditional forks, improving the power to 118 horsepower at 19,000 RPM. However, the NR500 saw little success and was eventually replaced by the incredibly successful two-stroke NS500. Despite being a technological marvel, the NR500 never won a single Grand Prix race, with its only notable victory being a national race at Suzuka in 1981, primarily due to a strategic pit stop advantage. Sure, it was a V4. Sure, it brought about the era of V4 racing in the 80s. It was radical with its 32 valves and oval pistons and ability to rev past 20,000 RPM, but the two strokes were just too good. Honda would move to making two strokes to stay competitive, and even with the later limited run NR750, which was based on the NR500, that was just an incredibly expensive limited edition bike. One would think that the V4 four-stroke would have just kind of gone to the wayside, but that wouldn't be the case. To start its production life, Honda decided that their V4 platform would be best suited to performance-oriented but American-styled cruisers like the V45 Sabre. Up until this point, Honda had avoided this entire power cruiser muscle bike segment, but alongside the Shadow, the Sabre was the first of its kind for the company. Then came the incredibly powerful for its time V65 Magna, which sold well. These bikes were amazingly powerful thanks to their connection to that NR500 race bike, aside from the oval pistons, obviously. Honda's first racing versions of these big fours would come in the form of the RS1000 RW and FWS 1000. Despite normal pistons, it was essentially a giant version of that NR500, more so than it was the Sabre or Magna. These bikes truly were the forefathers of Honda's V4 four-stroke racing bikes, going forward, including the current crop of MotoGP bikes. So basically, Honda went V4 race bike that sucked to V4 road bike that was kind of a cruiser but was also pretty awesome but didn't really sell worldwide, to V4 race bike that was pretty awesome, and now again it was time to make a road-going sport bike based on those race bikes, if that makes sense. Honda had invested millions and millions into this platform, and it was incredibly advanced, it was very high-tech, and it was time to cash in on a bike that would sell well. Enter the Interceptor, a motorcycle that many consider to be kind of one of the first modern sport bikes. Mind you, this is 1983, before the release of the GSXR 750. Here was an exotic V4 faired box-framed non-shaft drive, high-compression sport bike making about 86 horsepower with a top speed of close to 140 miles per hour. It was heavy, but that was to be expected, and it was only a bit more expensive than the competition. It sold well, and then in thoroughly non-Honda fashion, the bike started breaking down, mainly having to do with camshaft wear. And then Suzuki dropped the Gixxer 750, significantly more powerful, much more of a race bike for the road. Basically, it was a fully faired race bike, and it weighed in at about 100 pounds less than the Interceptor. Not good. And that Suzuki was an inline four, but nobody cared if it was an evolution of the UJM. It was just fantastic at what it was meant to do. It was the universal Japanese motorcycle of the future, right? Had Honda taken a wrong turn with this whole V4 project? Should Honda have been the ones who made the Gixxer, not Suzuki? Suzuki were supposed to be the two-stroke experts. Meanwhile, the Interceptor was proving to be more of an embarrassment for Honda than anything else, and instead of fixing the problems, Honda came out with more versions of the V4 in smaller and also larger capacity forms, but this really didn't help. A Yamaha RD350 LC could smoke a VF500. Then Honda made a race version, the VF1000R, and that failed miserably, described by Wayne Gardner as a marshmallow. Now, if he had been describing something like the Honda Moto Campo, that would be fine. But this was supposed to be Honda's absolute best for four-stroke performance. Being described as a marshmallow? Not good. Then the American tariffs came in, and the biggest change to the V4 platform came in the form of a capacity reduction. Honda was really struggling at this point, as their reputation for being on the cutting edge of performance, and more importantly, their reputation for reliability, was waning. And Yamaha was really trying to overtake Honda at this point as the biggest motorcycle manufacturer in the world, so Honda went to the race versions to figure out the V4's problems. These engines just weren't making enough power. Up until this point, Honda's V4s had never really reached their full potential, so they brought on Jerry Branch, who took the race versions of the 750 and brought them up to 120 horsepower thanks to his tweaks. And across the board, the race versions of the VF got better handling, weight savings, incredible bumps in power. Bikes like the RS 850 had amazingly flat torque curves for this time, a testament to Honda really figuring out the benefit of the V4 platform as we know today, which is basically endless torque everywhere in the rev range. For 84, the World Endurance Circuit reduced capacity to 750 cc's, which was perfect for Honda. They unveiled the all-new RS 750R, a bike that was much closer to the unbelievable two-stroke Grand Prix bike, the NS 500. Still, for the production sport bike market, Honda's V4s were no match for the improving inline-4 leader bikes of the likes of Suzuki and Yamaha and Kawasaki, so Honda launched the Hurricane, which was a thoroughly derivative line of sport bikes, copying Kawasaki's GPZ engines and also copying Ducati's styling. As the 80s carried on, it seemed like Honda had given up on the whole V4 project. But if you know anything about Honda's history, they're not one to give up easily, and this wasn't the first time that they'd hit a wall with a project. So they decided to take the V4 platform, which was at this time having some of its kinks worked out, and make one of the best, most forward-looking sport bikes of all time, the VFR 750. At the time, that is the mid-80s, the GSXR 750 was the gold standard for this class. Honda could have tried to compete directly with the GSXR, maybe hitting the same performance targets but maybe at a slightly lower price, something they'd surely done before, but instead they went a different route. First off, the VFR 750 was literally the RFV 750 race bike with headlights and a license plate. But despite being born on the racetrack and basically being a race bike in production guise, the VFR stood out for its sublime handling and stability and usability thanks to that V4 layout and for its incredible weight distribution. Its gear-driven camshaft gave it perfect timing and a race bike sound. The engine had loads of character, chalked up primarily to its 180-degree crankshaft, making each cylinder fire alone with less intervals between combustion. Honda and Yamaha would coin this term as the Big Bang engines with their race bikes going forward, but it really did originate here with the VFR. And the VFR was so good that it made Mike Doohan specifically ask that Honda make their Grand Prix 500cc two-strokes have the same setup as the VFR. This experimentation with different crank setups would be hugely influential for racing. Think Ducati's V4s and even Yamaha's revolutionary cross-plane inline 4s. The VFR weighed a bit more than the Gixxer, but made more power, and perhaps most interesting, it was styled so differently. With the VFR, Honda decided to essentially eliminate all the graphics and decals that were so popular at this time and all the flashy paint jobs, and they opted instead for a simple red, white, and blue paint scheme, and later just white. Few bikes have aged as well from this era in the looks department as the VFR, but also radically race-oriented motorcycles are rarely comfortable, but this is where the VFR was so revolutionary. Many noted that it made you a better rider. The ergonomics would be so influential on sport bikes going forward. It was its own unique, specific riding experience found nowhere else in the sport bike world, and VFR owners, I'm sure if you're watching this, you can confirm this in the comments below. But perhaps most importantly, the VFR restored faith in Honda's ability to make both high-tech advanced sport bikes, but also sport bikes that were reliable. In many ways, this was the first full-blown sports tourer, a formula that would be incredibly popular going forward, but the leader bike and sport bike craze of the 90s would in some ways deem the VFR useless despite it being way ahead of its time, and Honda's obsession with having their flagship sport bikes no longer be UJMs kind of seemed pointless at this point. The evolution of the UJM found in Kawasaki and Suzuki and Yamaha's wildly popular 1000 plus cc inline fours, made it so that Honda had to essentially go back to making these kinds of motorcycles, so they developed the CBR line, and the rest is history. Well, sort of. See, in racing, Honda's V4 concept stayed strong because, well, as we know, it worked. But as the VFR 750F was winning, that is, the full race version of the VFR, HRC was cooking up a prototype race bike more like their Grand Prix bikes, weighing even less thanks in part to things like titanium valves and magnesium flat side carbs, known initially as the 6X, but later in the form of the RC30. Now this bike would win the new World Superbike Championship in 88 and 89 and would go down as one of the single most important and influential Honda race bikes of all time, especially for modern big four-stroke racing, including its influence on the modern RC213. That's the bike that Marquez dominated on for all those years. The RC30 would also come in production form just because it had to in terms of homologation, and it's an incredibly collectible, awesome bike. Honda would rethink and recreate their V-form platforms in the decades following the RC30. It really was an evolution, but they did make radical changes to get to where they are today in terms of racing. In the coming years, the V4 platform really waned for Honda for their production models, but it didn't quite go to the wayside. But it would change massively, as the whole concept of the Sport Tourer would change. In the form of the VFR 800 of the late 90s and early 2000s, many consider this one of the best iterations of Honda's road-going V4s, the prime example for what the VFR is really all about. In many ways, it was derivative of Honda's RC45 race bike, but again with that added level of usability and comfort, but still thoroughly a sport bike, at least for most riders. It made 110 horsepower and a whopping 59 foot-pounds of torque while weighing around 450 pounds. It was fuel injected. It had all the best of late 90s tech, all the good tech, not the crap that gets in the way. It was slowly becoming more premium and thus more expensive, and unfortunately for Honda, the revived Triumph brand alongside companies like BMW, they were making bikes in this sport touring class that many considered better, so Honda decided to change the whole VFR project a bit. Enter VTEC. More commonly associated with Honda's four-wheeled vehicles, this is a bit of tech that's never been without its problems. There's class action lawsuits that you can look up, but not really relating to motorcycles as far as I know. Anyways, VTEC essentially makes the engine run on less valves when at lower RPMs to boost bottom end power. The problem for motorcycles with VTEC hasn't so much been the burning of excess oil and the problems with making engines super unreliable, rather it's the transition when VTEC kicks in and out on a motorcycle. You can feel it on a car, you can really feel it on a motorcycle. Honda made multiple versions of the VFR 800 VTEC. They tried to work out the kinks. There was this 800cc version, but then also the VFR 1200. They also used the VFR platform for their DCT technology. But now there's no VFR in the Honda lineup. These have just completely gone away because nobody really wants them. I think Jensen Beeler really sums up the demise of the VFR project well.
I think it might just be like philosophy and idea. Because one of the other things I wanted to circle back to was what you were talking about with the VFR 1200. And it's not a bad bike. It's not a bad bike.
No.
It's just not a VFR. When you look at that lineup of motorcycles and the history that it has, I think Honda has done such a disservice to VFR owners and in a way has left them by the wayside with where they've taken that brand, maybe not realizing that there was a loyal brand that they were building here along the same vein as, say, a Goldwing.
Yeah.
And they've kind of been abandoned. And I think the VFR 1200 was the bike that really solidified that abandonment, because it's not a great tour. It's not a sport bike. It's heavy. It's big. Yeah. Okay. It's got the V4 engine in it. And the VFR line, I think Honda tried to take the modern day VFRs and make them the showcase for its best technologies.
Yeah.
They were the first, I want to say they were the first bikes from Honda to come with ABS. They were the first bikes
the VVT.
The first bike from Honda to come with the VTEC, branded as VTEC, variable valve timing. And then they were the first bike to come with the dual clutch transmission, the DCT. And, I don't think that's what VFR owners are in it for. And I don't think Honda really got that.
What's strange is that Honda is still committed to the V4 formula, but just for racing. But see, Ducati and Aprilia have showed just how good these platforms can be for big sport bikes and street fighters, and these bikes are developed in coordination with their current MotoGP race bikes. I personally think that it would be cool if Honda brought back the VFR 750. It'd be awesome if people could get their hands on a smaller V4 sport bike so that you don't have to buy one of these 200 horsepower, like $35,000 motorcycles, something that's a bit more affordable but is a true sport bike or sport tourer. What's difficult to understand is why Honda decided to relegate their iconic and wonderful V4 engine to essentially being a bloated, tech-heavy sport tourer that really didn't do sport or touring all that well, which is just so unlike the early VFRs. I would love to hear from you guys, especially you VFR fanatics, as I'm pretty sure you're out there and you're probably watching this. As always, guys, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Ride safe.